In the annals of great last stands throughout history, few battles were as desperate or potentially one-sided as the Battle of Rorke's Drift. However, Company B of the British 24th Regiment of Foot would be the rock upon which the Zulu tidal wave would break upon. Outnumbered 23-1, the decision to hold their ground and make a stand against a force of 4,000 elite Zulu Impi warriors must have sounded like certain death. Yet the men of Company B and their comrades at Rorke's Drift would earn their place in the most hallowed halls of warriors, seated among those who defied the odds, those who accepted what would be their fate, and those who looked the spectre of annihilation in the face and said, "Not today." The destiny of Company B would be set following the Battle of Isandlwana. The main British force in the area was utterly destroyed by the Zulu army earlier in the day. The Zulu reserve, the 4,000-man Undi Corps, would be deprived of participating in the great victory that morning. They were fresh and determined to prove their worth as warriors. So, they diverted 6 miles towards Rorke's Drift in order to win a great victory for themselves and prevent the escape of any British men or supplies. News quickly reached the men of Company B and their comrades at Rorke's Drift that the main force had been slain and the Zulus were en route to their position. Steely-eyed and with a stiff upper lip, these absolute chaps opted that the best bet was to stand and fight, rather than risk being caught in the open with a large supply train of wounded and material. They could have abandoned their wounded and reconsolidated or fled out of cowardice in the face of such a hopeless situation. But the soldiers and officers of the British Army decided that live or die, a stand would have to be made. The British only had around 4.5 hours to prepare their defense. They stacked whatever they could to reinforce the walls and fences of the small missionary outpost they had been using as a storehouse and field hospital. They used mostly bags of grain and empty crates. The officers ordered every box of ammunition to be opened and prepped for use. For this fight, they would need enough rounds to supply a whole army. As the Zulus neared, the other companies of Allied troops that had arrived throughout the day broke and ran. With their force greatly diminished, it was now up to the 150 men of Company B and the wounded who could still fire weapons to hold off a tidal wave of spears and bullets. At around 4:30 p.m., the battle began with multiple Impi charges. The Zulus would arrive in force, attacking the south wall while looping around to the north wall simultaneously. Some moved quickly atop a nearby bluff and engaged with rifles and muskets, shooting harassing fire down into the compound. As the Zulus swarmed the wall, many of the British on the barricade began to engage in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. With bayonets fixed and with the thoughts of Queen, God and tea on their minds, they held out bitterly. By 6 p.m., the north wall could no longer be held, and the hospital's firing ports had become compromised. A desperate fight ensued inside of the hospital house as Zulus poured in through holes in the wall and windows. The men inside valiantly held off the attackers with bayonets and pistols as their comrades hastily bashed and cut holes in the walls in order to get the wounded to safety. At this point, even the critically wounded were engaged in hand-to-hand fighting. After 50 minutes that must have felt like a whole day, the egress ports were large enough to carry men through. 9 out of the 11 patients made it out, as did all the able-bodied men, though most were now heavily wounded in some way. With the hospital now ablaze and the perimeter collapsing, the remaining men withdrew into a tight perimeter in the center of the compound. Side by side with their brothers in arms, they engaged wave after wave of Zulu charges. They fought with everything they had, often reduced to their bayonets. The Zulu charged through the night, with the attack only beginning to slacken after midnight and finally ended at 2 in the morning. The discipline and bravery of every fighting man there had held the ground and won the day. As dawn broke the next day, 14 men were dead, with 10 more being critically wounded. Every man had sustained a wound or injury. Of the 20,000 rounds the British had in reserve, only 900 remained. After 10 hours of fighting, that small contingent of valorous men gave everything they had, and nearly shot everything they had. At 8 in the morning the next day, the British reinforcing column finally arrived. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, the most ever received for a single action by one regiment. The morality of the conflict and the actions of governments will always be subject to critique and ire. However, one thing that can always be commended, and should continue to echo through the ages, is when the strength of the human spirit and the will of men combine to spit in the eye of destiny. The men at Rorke's Drift, with a little blood dripping from their noses and lips, did just that.